Welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're going back in time to Western Canada. Yeah, the late 1800s and early 1900s, to be exact.
Ah, yes, a period of massive transformation. It's like looking through a kaleidoscope, a mix of historical documents, personal stories, and even glimpses into how this era is taught today.
We're going to unearth the impact of, you guessed it, government policies, and how those policies affected the lives of all those people who ended up calling Western Canada home.
Right. It really highlights the ripple effects of those decisions, especially on the various cultural groups who were shaping the West.
So imagine this vast landscape, eh?
Mm-hmm.
First Nations and Métis communities, right?
Yeah.
European fur traders who'd been there for a while.
Yep.
And then picture the rumble of that new Canadian Pacific Railway
Mm-hmm.
cutting right through the prairies.
It really was a time of ambition, wasn't it? A drive to connect this vast country.
The Canadian government had this big vision, right? This national policy, they called it. The idea was to attract immigrants to settle the West.
It was a three-pronged approach, really. Attract immigrants, build that railway, and of course, boost the Canadian economy. On the surface, it seemed like a win-win.
But of course, nothing's ever that simple.
Right. Because it wasn't an empty land just waiting for newcomers. It was already home to a bunch of diverse communities, each with their own histories and cultures and ways of life.
So how'd this national policy actually pan out for the people who were already there, the ones who already called the West home?
Well, the effects, they were kind of a mixed bag. It really depended on who you were. Some people saw it as a land of opportunity, like a chance to start fresh.
A new beginning?
But others felt more like they were pushed aside, marginalized, or even exploited.
Right, like one group's gain was another group's loss.
Yeah, and a really powerful example of this comes from a Manassas grandmother, I think it was. She said, "We keep moving west to find land, but there's nowhere left to go now."
That's a powerful statement. It really captures that feeling of displacement, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Being pushed further and further away from your home, your way of life.
Absolutely. And it highlights that tension, right? The government's vision for a unified Canada, butting up against the reality of Indigenous peoples' experiences.
Okay, so let's get into some specific examples of how this played out. We have those agreements, right? The numbered treaties that the government made with First Nations to, I guess, secure land for all this new settlement.
Yeah, but here's the thing. These treaties were supposed to be like these formal agreements, but they were often really overshadowed by miscommunication and differing interpretations. They didn't always see eye to eye.
Like, almost like they were speaking different languages even though they're using the same words.
Exactly. So the Canadian government, they saw these treaties as pretty straightforward, like land surrenders.
Give us the land and we'll.
Yeah, but many First Nations, they understood them more as agreements to share the land, the resources.
Like, not a complete giving up, more like a sharing.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that's a big difference. It's no wonder there was conflict, right?
Oh, yeah, totally. So any specific example of this clash?
Oh, definitely. Treaty 7, it involved the Blackfoot Confederacy, and it really shows how good intentions, I guess, can really get lost in translation.
All right, Treaty 7, lay it on me. What happened there?
Well, during the negotiations, Siksika chief Ispamutsika, you might know him as Crowfoot,
Oh, yeah, Crowfoot.
made a pretty powerful statement. He basically said, we're the children of the plains, the buffalo is our food, I will sign the treaty. But what did signing the treaty really mean to him? That's the key question.
Exactly. Was it like, okay, fine, you can have the land? Or was it more like, we can share this?
Right. On paper, it looked like surrender, but oral histories passed down through generations, well, they tell a different story. It's this ongoing clash of worldviews, different legal traditions and understandings of what land ownership actually means.
So it's a communication breakdown with huge repercussions.
Exactly. And on top of these treaties, you have this whole other issue, the government's policy of assimilation.
Trying to absorb First Nations into mainstream Canadian society, right?
Yes, and this policy, unfortunately, had a pretty devastating impact. It went on for generations. One of the main tools, of course, was the residential school system.
The schools that took Indigenous kids away from their families, right? Stripping them of their language and culture.
Yeah, they were forbidden from speaking their languages, practicing their traditions, even just acknowledging their own identity. Can you imagine that? Being taken from your family, forced to live somewhere where everything familiar to you is forbidden.
It's a really dark chapter in Canadian history, and it still affects generations of Indigenous people today.
Absolutely. So while this was happening with First Nations and Metis communities, you had all these immigrants pouring in from Eastern Europe, drawn by the promise of land and religious freedom.
A fresh start, a chance to build a new life.
Yeah, and these immigrants, mostly from Ukraine, Poland, Romania, they had a huge impact, especially in agriculture. They transformed the prairies into Canada's breadbasket.
Their expertise and hard work really helped build the West. But it couldn't have been easy for them, though, right? Starting over in a new country.
Starting over is never easy. Imagine not speaking the language, not understanding the customs. There are a lot of stories of resilience from this time, but also a lot of hardship.
Yeah, I bet. Any particular story that sticks out to you?
There's this one about a Ukrainian woman, Millie Melnick. She learned English by singing songs in school. She said, I didn't know any English when I started. We sang all the time, Scotch songs, Irish songs, even God Save the King. It shows you their determination, right?
Yeah, that desire to adapt and belong. But sadly, not all immigrant groups were welcomed with open arms, were they?
No, definitely not. While Chinese laborers were initially welcome to build the railway, they encountered a ton of discrimination once it was finished. It's a sad example of how quickly attitudes can change.
Yeah, from "we need you" to "you're not welcome."
Exactly. They faced dangerous conditions, low pay, and many died building that railway. And then, instead of being thanked, they became targets of things like the Chinese head tax.
Ah, yeah, remind me about that one again.
It was this fee they slapped on Chinese immigrants entering Canada. It started at $50 back in 1885, which was a lot of money, and then it just kept increasing. By 1903, it was a whopping $500.
Wow, that's a huge barrier to entry. It basically made it impossible for many families to immigrate or even just reunite.
And as if that wasn't bad enough, in 1923, they went and enacted the Chinese Exclusion Act, which basically banned all Chinese immigration for decades. Families were ripped apart, communities were devastated, a whole culture was pushed aside.
You have a dark mark on Canada's history for sure.
Absolutely. And while all this was going on, there were also Francophone communities in the West who were already established long before all this rapid immigration started.
Oh, that's right. So they went from being the majority to being a minority basically overnight. What happened to them as the demographics shifted?
Imagine watching your language, your culture, slowly fading as the world around you changes. They fought hard to preserve their identity, organizing, advocating, going to court to protect their language rights. It was a battle for survival.
A struggle to hold on to who they were.
And a prime example of this struggle is the Manitoba schools question, which blew up in 1890.
Fill me in. What was the Manitoba schools question all about?
In a nutshell, the Manitoba government abolished funding for Catholic schools, which at that time were mainly Francophone. This was seen as a direct attack on their ability to educate their kids in French and in their faith.
It was more than just education. It was about cultural survival.
Absolutely. It sparked this huge debate across the country about language rights, religious freedom, and whether the government should protect minority cultures. It was a real turning point.
Wow, so much tension brewing in this era. It sounds like the government's national policy, while intended to unify and build the nation, also triggered all sorts of unintended consequences. And it seems like everyone was affected in some way.
That's one way to put it. It's like a chain reaction, with each action leading to another, and sometimes the outcomes were not what anyone expected. But we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to unpack.
Well, I'm ready to keep digging. What else have we got?
Oh, plenty.
Yeah.
We haven't even talked about the rise of the ranching industry or the unique experiences of women during this time. It's a fascinating tapestry of stories, challenges, and triumphs.
Sounds like we've got our work cut out for us. Let's take a break and come back for more, shall we?
You know, thinking about those stories, like Millie Melnick learning English through songs, it makes you realize how much individual experiences matter, like how they fit into this bigger historical picture, right?
Yeah, for sure. Each story adds a whole other layer to how we understand this time period. It's not just like policies and economics, it's real people, right?
Yeah.
Real people trying to make sense of it all.
Exactly. And it makes me think about this whole concept of active citizenship, right? It's about people, individuals, and groups realizing that they can actually influence things, that they have a voice, that they can make a difference.
So it's not just about going with the flow, it's about like grabbing the reins and shaping your own destiny. Like those First Nations leaders who negotiated the Numbered Treaties, right?
Absolutely. They weren't just signing on the dotted line, they were strategizing, trying to get the best deal for their people in a world that was changing really fast.
They knew they had to act, to be diplomatic, especially when the power dynamic was so, like, tilted.
Yeah, and even though those treaties often had, like we said, a lot of misunderstandings and different interpretations, those leaders were still stepping up. They were making their voices heard, trying to shape the future for their communities.
They were players in the game, even if the rules weren't always fair.
Right. And we see that same kind of active citizenship with the immigrants from Eastern Europe, too. They weren't just content to, like, farm the land. They built communities, they built churches and schools, they started cultural organizations.
They were building a life, a whole identity, not just like a job.
Exactly. And the Chinese community, wow, they faced so much discrimination, but they were incredibly resilient.
Talk about perseverance. Even with the head tax and the Exclusion Act, they still managed to create businesses, build Chinatowns, and fight for their rights.
They refused to be pushed around. They organized. They challenged unjust laws. It really shows the power of collective action, even when the system is stacked against you.
And the Francophones too, right? Fighting to keep their language and culture alive as the West became more and more diverse.
That whole Manitoba schools question really highlights their fight for survival.
It was about way more than just schools. It was about, like, the core of their identity.
Totally. They understood that education was key to preserving their culture, and they were willing to fight for it.
So active citizenship can look like a lot of things, eh?
Oh, yeah, from negotiating treaties to building communities to taking the government to court. It's about realizing that we're not just along for the ride, we can actually steer the ship.
We can make waves, make a difference. And that's a message that's just as important now as it was back then.
Totally. Because we're still dealing with so many of those same issues today, right?
Yeah.
Social justice, equality, representation. It's an ongoing struggle.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about how the government influenced things. But it's not just about big policies, right? Individuals made choices too.
Of course. It's like a dance, right?
Right.
Between those big historical forces and the choices that people made within those constraints.
Like the government sets the stage, and then real people have to figure out how to act, how to survive, how to thrive.
Exactly. The government creates the framework, but it's the people who bring this story to life.
That's what makes history so fascinating. It's about those choices, those little moments that add up to something bigger.
And it's about understanding that the past isn't just a bunch of names and dates. It's about human experiences, real people living through real challenges.
That helps us understand ourselves better, you know?
Absolutely. We see how those choices played out, the consequences, both good and bad. And it can help us make better choices today.
Okay, so let's talk about something specific. That ranching boom, it's pretty captivating. Why was the government so gung-ho about ranching in the West?
Well, it was strategic. They saw it as a way to, like, score a few goals at once. First, it would boost the economy, bring in some foreign investment, especially from Britain.
Push money.
Exactly. And second, it was a way to, like, plant their flag on the prairies, you know? Assert Canadian control, keep those American cattle companies from taking over.
It was about economics and national pride.
Right. And they were willing to put their money where their mouth was. They offered those huge land leases at super cheap prices, built railways, and even put up tariffs to protect Canadian ranchers from competition.
So they created this whole system to make ranching successful. And it worked, didn't it? Alberta became cattle country.
Oh, yeah, big time. Jobs, investment, new settlers, the whole 9 yards. But like with so many things during this time, there were some downsides too, especially for Indigenous communities.
Oh, right. When one group wins, another often loses.
Yeah, all those new ranches and cattle, well, they often pushed Indigenous peoples off their traditional territories. Their hunting grounds were fenced off, their access to resources was restricted, their whole way of life was disrupted.
Progress for some, but at a cost to others. It's a familiar story, unfortunately.
And it's a reminder to look deeper, to see the whole picture. Ranching brought economic growth, but it also brought dispossession and cultural disruption.
It's a complicated legacy that we're still grappling with today.
Absolutely. And while all this was happening with the ranchers, there was another group whose experiences were crucial: the farmers.
The backbone of the West, right? The ones who literally fed the nation.
Exactly. And they were the ones most directly affected by the national policy, for better or for worse. Remember, that policy was all about agriculture. The government wanted to turn the West into this giant breadbasket.
Free land, the railway, it was all designed to get people farming.
Right. And it did lead to a huge increase in production. But a lot of farmers, they weren't exactly thrilled with how things were going.
Wait, weren't they supposed to be the big winners here?
That was the idea, but the reality was a bit more complicated. Many Western farmers felt like the policy was actually rigged to benefit Eastern Canada.
Like they were getting the short end of the stick.
Exactly. Those high tariffs on foreign goods made their equipment more expensive, and the high cost of transporting their grain ate into their profits.
So they were stuck paying more for everything and then getting squeezed on the other end too.
Yeah, and it created a lot of resentment. They felt like the government wasn't listening to them, like they were being ignored.
So what do they do about it? Just grumble and bear it?
They weren't the type to sit back and take it. They started organizing, forming groups like the Territorial Grain Growers Association and the United Farmers of Alberta.
They got political.
And they sure did. They held rallies, lobbied the government. They wanted lower tariffs, fairer transportation rates, a more equal share of the pie.
They knew that if they wanted change, they had to fight for it.
Yeah.
Did they get anywhere?
Oh, they definitely made some noise. They were instrumental in establishing the Wheat Board, which helped stabilize grain prices, and they pushed through some transportation reforms that made things a bit easier for them.
It's amazing how much they accomplished by banding together.
It shows you what people can do when they unite and demand change, even when they're up against powerful interests. It's a powerful reminder that we all have a voice and that collective action can make a real difference.
And that's a message that resonates today, for sure. But we've covered a lot of ground already. From those individual stories of resilience, to the ranching boom, to the farmers' struggle for fairness. It's clear this era was a real turning point for Western Canada, full of contradictions and complexities.
It was a time of massive transformation, with policies and individual choices shaping the landscape and the society. And we've seen how different groups, Indigenous peoples, immigrants, Francophones, ranchers, farmers, all navigated those challenges and opportunities.
It's been a fascinating journey so far, and it makes you appreciate how much work went into building the West as we know it today. But before we wrap up, there's one group we haven't talked about yet. The women.
Yes. Their stories are often overlooked, but they were absolutely essential to the development of the West. They were the unsung heroes, the backbone of families and communities, and their contributions deserve to be recognized.
Okay, so let's dive into their world in the next part of our deep dive. Okay, so we've been talking about Western Canada in the late 1800s and early 1900s, right? All those big changes, all those different groups trying to make a life for themselves. But now it's time to talk about a group whose stories often get left out. Women.
Yeah, it's like they were working in the shadows, their contributions not always making it into the official records, but they were essential to building the West.
So let's shed some light on their experiences. What were their lives actually like back then? I mean, there were all these societal expectations about what women should and shouldn't do, right?
Oh, for sure. The late 1800s and early 1900s were all about domesticity for women, the whole wife and mother, keeper of the home thing. But even within those roles, they were having a huge impact on Western society.
It's like they were the foundation, holding everything together.
Exactly. Take homesteading, for instance. We often picture those rugged pioneers, men battling the elements, taming the land. But women were right there with them every step of the way, building homes, raising kids, and often contributing directly to the farm's success.
So it wasn't just about cooking and cleaning.
No way. Many women were expert gardeners, which meant food on the table. Some raised livestock, bringing in extra income. And think about the resourcefulness it took to run a household back then, with limited supplies and everything. They were masters of making do.
I can't even imagine. It sounds incredibly challenging.
Oh, it absolutely was. And on top of all that, they were also finding ways to create opportunities for themselves and their communities outside of the homestead.
You mentioned entrepreneurship earlier. How did women make that work in the West?
Well, for some, it was a path to independence, a way to make their own money and contribute to the local economy. Some women opened shops, selling everything from food to clothes. Others ran boarding houses, providing a place for all those new folks arriving all the time.
They were like filling in the gaps, doing what needed to be done.
Precisely. They saw the needs and found ways to meet them. They were vital to how those towns and cities grew and developed.
And let's not forget about community building. It feels like women were at the center of that too.
Absolutely. They were the ones starting schools, teaching in them. They organized churches, bringing people together for spiritual and social support. They created social groups, offering a sense of belonging in a place where so many people were strangers to each other.
It's like they created that sense of connection that makes a community strong, especially when everyone's from somewhere else trying to figure out how to be a part of this new place.
They were the glue, that's for sure. It's often said that a community is only as strong as its women, and that was definitely true in the West. They were the heart and soul of it all.
We've talked about how different groups struggled to keep their cultures alive with all the changes happening. Did women play a role in that too?
Oh, a huge role. Think about it. They were the primary caregivers, the ones passing down traditions and stories and languages to their kids, whether it was through music or storytelling or even just family recipes. They were the ones keeping those cultural threads alive.
Like the guardians of memory, making sure that those pieces of the past didn't disappear.
Exactly. So, their work might not have always been recognized in the history books, but it was essential to making Western Canada what it is today. They were the unsung heroes.
And it reminds us that we need to dig deeper to look for those missing pieces of the story.
For sure. History is always more interesting, more complete, when we include everyone's experiences. And that means acknowledging the vital role that women played in shaping the West.
I'm left thinking about all those women whose names we might never know, but whose contributions are still felt today. It's a powerful reminder that history is about more than just famous people and big events. It's about everyday people making a difference.
Absolutely. And this deep dive, it's been a journey of discovery for me, seeing how all these pieces fit together, the policies, the economics, the personal stories. It really paints a vivid picture of what life was like back then.
Me too. And I hope our listeners feel inspired to keep digging, keep learning about this fascinating period in Canadian history. There are so many stories waiting to be uncovered, so much to learn from the past.
Well said. Keep asking questions, keep challenging those old narratives, and keep diving deep.
Until next time, folks, happy learning.